I worked first with the nuclear program for 6 years and then the space program for 12 years. Exciting times. What did I learn from the nuclear program that I was able to transmit to the space program? Many things. Most important thing was, after India exploded its first bomb in 1973, 7 Western countries had imposed severe sanctions on India. The sanctions had not yet affected the space program, but I was sure that they would come. So, when I joined the space program, one of the first things I did was to present a list of 100 critical items important for the space program, mostly materials, but other systems as well, which would be the first to be sanctioned if sanctions ever came on the space program. I found that Professor Dhawan was completely in tune with what I presented, but he wanted me to keep the list secret. So the list was secret until today. I never revealed it to anybody. So during the 12 years I was with ISRO, among other things, one of the things I steered was to prepare and get self-reliance for these 100 items. By the time I left ISRO, in 12 years, 95% of the list was developed and indigenized by the Indian industry, which was one of my main roles. It was a self-reliance campaign. A handful like carbon fiber cloth, liquid hydrogen, etc., followed a couple of years later after I left. I prepared the ground for them. When sanctions from Western countries inevitably came, ISRO was 99% unaffected. I could say totally unaffected. We had prepared the ground for it well in advance. There was a bit of a comic epilogue. One of the items in the list of 100 was ammonium perchlorate, which was the main oxidizer for solid propellants. The oxidizer in solid propellants constitutes nearly 70% of the weight of the solid propellant. Mainly for boosters, solid boosters, not for small rockets, boosters. The main source of ammonium perchlorate for the US program, for NASA, was a Canadian plant, which unfortunately blew up. It's an oxidizer, so if you find a fuel nearby, it can explode. Frantic search by the Allies produced nothing. They couldn't get the oxidizer from any of their own allies. The French could produce very little. The Japanese, on the other hand, could produce more, but they raised the price as soon as their ally wanted material. This is very crazy. So finally, India was approached. I knew what was happening. I was the chairman of the Technology Transfer and Director for Industry Cooperation, and I handled this. I offered NASA the best quality ammonium perchlorate in bulk at absurdly low price. I had a strategy in mind. NASA was delighted, absolutely delighted. They couldn't get anything like this anywhere. I asked the puzzled NASA team for Commerce Department representative in the final negotiations. US Commerce Department representative. NASA was puzzled, but they said, okay, we'll get. The problem was that ammonium perchlorate was banned for India by those 7 countries. They couldn't export even a gram of ammonium perchlorate. And from India to India. And from India, they wanted ammonium perchlorate in bulk quantities. So this was the absurdity. but my offer stood with NASA, provided the banned list was dumped. That was the only condition I put. I can lower the price, I can give you more quantities, I can do anything. Remove that banned list. They asked me, why? I mean, why are you insisting on this? I said, you're a democracy, we're a democracy. Somebody in parliament, an MP, will get up and then ask my prime minister, who is the minister for space, that, what the hell are you doing, Mr. Prime Minister? Why are you exporting the Americans ammonium perchlorate when they have banned it for you? What will he answer? You ask your Commerce Department to answer. The answer never came from NASA. This is one of the things I learned, that if you cannot overcome, you obviate. One of the things, I'm coming to another episode, you know well that committee chairmen don't walk out of meetings. They have to chair the meeting, they cannot walk out. I had to set a precedent. I was chairing a task force to determine number of additional employees for the ISRO Satellite Center in view of IRS, etc., etc. Mr. M.G. Chandrasekhar, the then head PAG of ISAC and much later founder of the notorious Devas, resisted any negotiation at the venue. So seeing no way to proceed, I walked out. As a chairman, I walked out and resisted all efforts to make me come back. Much later, Professor U.R. Rao, then director ISAC, came up with a compromise to let me proceed. There are sometimes organizations can make fools of themselves. This was one major occasion. My first major self-imposed job in ISRO was negating a prestigious project. Our huge chemicals and propellants group in VSSC had proposed conversion of tree-based seed oils, like sal oil, mahu oil, presumably going waste in forests according to them, into substitute for crude oil. Can you imagine? It's a seed oil. Some of the seed oils are even edible. They want to convert them into crude oil. Anyway, this was endorsed from the top. Widely publicized, state government roped in to activate tribals to collect the seeds and was about to be funded by ISRO. I had no choice but to play spoil sport fast. Spoil sport. I prepared an exhaustive analysis on technical and economic absurdity of scheme, showed it to Mr. Chandrasekhar as well, got Professor Dhawan to send it to eminent economist Ashok Mitra, then Finance Minister of West Bengal. That was the end of the project. They had sponsored it, the state government, but when this was sent to them, the economists had no choice but to cancel that. I earned the eternal ire of the project protagonists, that was the chemicals, materials and propellants group in VSSC, the biggest group in VSSC. I finally took Professor Dhawan as a terminal assurance to Hindustan Lever in Bombay, where the then chairman, Mr. T. Thomas, pointed to him higher value uses of tree seed oils like sal, yielding cocoa butter. They were working on cocoa butter, Hindustan Lever. Cocoa butter substitute and not crude. This convinced Professor Dhawan, and that was the end of this project called Space Crude. What a name for it, Space Crude. There were somewhat technical requirements. Very important was PBAN, polybutadiene acrylonitrile acrylic acid. It's a terpolymer, 3 ingredients in it, who are polymerized together. Was the backbone of our launch vehicles at that time. That is SLV, ASLV, etc. They were using this. And this was the same solid propellant, this terpolymer, for shuttle as well at the same time. So, how to indigenize acrylic acid was a challenge for me and for my scientists. They had come up with an elaborate scheme running to crores of rupees to set up a plant for acrylonitrile. So, a petrochemical specialist like me, in IIT Madras had specialized in petrochemicals, I recommended that we forget synthesizing acrylic acid completely, but simply hydrolyze acrylonitrile, in which India produced abundantly, produced in bulk, and get acrylic acid at no great capital expenditure. This was, for a polymer scientist and a chemist, this was really topsy-turvy, because on large scale, acrylonitrile is an intermediate for acrylonitrile and not the other way about. You don't take the final product and hydrolyze it and get the intermediate product. But that is what we needed. We needed acrylic acid in smaller quantities. But we were producing acrylonitrile in large quantities. So this is what made sense for us. So that was finally reluctantly absorbed and accepted by our polymer scientists. Certain organizational matters used to cause headaches. To unify solid propellants under one head, to unify the efforts in solid propellants, it became desirable to put SPROB, solid propellant huge plant, in Shar center and the propellants group in one unified command under single command. So one was in Shar center, the other was in VSSC. The only right person for this was Mr. M.R. Kurup, senior man, very experienced, able to command. Respect. Will Mr. Kurup agree to report to two different bosses, one of whom was actually antagonistic to him? Will anybody agree to this? Has anything like this been done anywhere, corporate sector, anywhere? I don't think so. It was not there at that time, and I don't think it's there now. Not likely at all. The Center Director of VSSC, Dr. Brahmprakash, posed this dilemma to me. I rushed to VSSC and simply appealed to Mr. Kurup's organizational loyalty. We had a very good relationship. I appealed to his loyalty, which had not been done till then. He asked me in the end of a half-an-hour conversation, "Are you convinced?" M.R.K. Kurup's consent was promptly taken to Brahmprakash, the director, the number 2 man in ISRO at that time, who was unbelieving and quite bemused. He was surprised. T.N. Seshan was a great colleague of mine, right from atomic energy days. We had a great relationship. He was a senior colleague in atomic energy. He later partly facilitated my move to space. He even aided me professionally after I quit space and venture capital. I was always a great admirer of his, though I never cared too much for bureaucrats. I was budget director of ISRO and he was budget officer of DOS, Department of Space. In an annual budget meeting, Professor Dhawan asked all budget officers to raise their hands, maybe to reprimand them. I protested that one of them had not complied. After a long silence, Seshan reluctantly did. He raised his hand. He was the person who had first not raised his hand. To universal mirth, he was very much feared by all. Next episode with the Seshan, many with him, the chairman of the negotiating committee to settle our bulk purchase price for nitrogen tetroxide with the potential producer. Nitrogen tetroxide is the main liquid oxidizer for launch vehicles. N2O4 it's called. The public sector HOC had been selected. Session had already got the approval of member finance for rupees 17 per kilo. When I told him that I had finalized rupees 13 per kilo, his instant reaction was he had already obtained approval for 17 per kilo. Then he suddenly realized what he had said and then caught his breath. HOC sadly, as an epilogue, sadly lost 7 men in a leakage accident in the N24 plant. It's a highly toxic material. It's an acid. It causes nitric acid inside. At my instigation, we started a 3 departments project. ISRO, the Department of Space, Department of Electronics, and Department of Atomic Energy, to make beryllium. Very rare. This was going to be the 3rd plant in the world to make beryllium, to extract beryllium. He is an expert in this. Chandra. In Vashi, New Bombay, at that time. But entirely with BRC technology. We are totally dependent on BRC for this. We had to develop it from scratch, from laboratory scale up into pilot scale. There were a lot of delays because of the monsoon in Bombay and further because of delays in sand harvesting, sand extraction. There was a strike of the people who, extract sand and bring it in trucks. After detailed, grueling discussion, the representative of MF from Delhi offered to remove any adverse remarks on our UDMH project if we agree to vindicate, if we agree to blame DAE on beryllium. That is, if we blame our sister department on beryllium, we will not touch you when it comes to other things. We will remove any adverse remarks. So I remonstrated at this fish market, bargaining, and refused point blank, under any circumstances, any adverse comments on DAE. Finally, there were no adverse remarks either on DAE or BRC or us, or BRC. Now, UDMH, which I mentioned earlier, is unsymmetrical dimethyl hydrazine, which is the main fuel in liquid engines for boosters. We produce it in our country now, and we produce the N2O4 also, the oxidizer. Now, what about the huge difference in size between ASLV, SLV and PSLV? There's a huge difference in size. We are not talking of double the size and triple the size, and we're talking of 10, 20 times the size. So that is PSLV, which is now our workhorse. The BSSC committee for this had already selected the same steel which was used for SLV and ASLV, the previous launch vehicles, as the booster casing. Only the head of materials in VSSC had protested, one Dr. B.K. Sarkar. I joked during a high-level presentation by Srinivasan, the project director of PSLV, that unless you have a much higher tensile strength material, the vehicle won't even lift off. That was a joke. And appealed to Prof Sarabhai that the choice must be changed. Dr. Valluri, who had a close relationship with Prof Sarabhai, had argued with him against Maharajing steel, the logical candidate according to all of us, because Maharajing steel had a high fracture toughness. So Dhawan was reluctant. I forced him to set up a national expert committee so that you have an excuse that you've gone beyond, you've gone to the nation. The National Expert Committee really had national experts, top class people. Arunachalam, Srinivasan, others who were eminent metallurgists. The committee endorsed Maraging Steel instantly and unanimously in one meeting. Midani was the only possible producer. Here is another comic comic interlude. During negotiations with Midani, I intercepted the project director of PSLV, passing a chit of paper to the Midani managing director. Got it. Believe me, this really happened. There was a prize written there. So our stand was being revealed by our people to the opposite side. You can imagine what consequences followed. Kalam was a member of our side, usually unflappable, he won't speak much. Even he was outraged, Kalam. This was the kind of things that were going on. So when we talk technology, we often forget about incidents of this nature which cause problems, which cause defeats if we don't prevent them. UDMH was another saga. It was a chosen liquid fuel, a hypergolic liquid fuel for PSLV second stage and MMH is monomethyl hydrazine for fourth stage. After wrong choice of route, waste of money and time, and deploying IDPL as the failed vendor, that finally the traditional UDMH route was chosen. Andhra Sugars, a new entrant, agreed to produce both in bulk after technology transfer. Showed them also that dilute UDMH was being imported in large quantities into India as a plant growth regulator in Jammu and Kashmir and Himachal Pradesh for apple orchards. This is a puzzling application. We also learnt it for the first time. But when we showed it to Andhra Sugars, this report, and took a bottle of this material, gave it to them, they were delighted. They quickly made an estimate of what the market would be, apart from what they had committed to sell to us as UDMH, as fuel, propellant. They started marketing it, started the preparatory marketing in Himachal Pradesh and Jammu and Kashmir in apple growers. We were very happy. We didn't care where it was going. We only wanted to point out to the industry that these are the possibilities that we have come across. Why don't you follow it up and profit from it? In the meantime, just as a reserve action, Professor Dhawan asked his counterpart in the USSR to reserve a quantity of UDMH for us if we required. This was agreed to, but never used. We're completely self-sufficient in N2O4, UDMH, and others. By now I had learned the power of walkouts. How unexpectedly you can walk out. I had learned from opposition in Parliament as well. I needed the liquid hypergolic oxidizer in hundreds of tons for the PSLV program. That is N2O4, nitrogen tetroxide. Went for help in the beginning to nitric acid producers in the country. Without result. Except one. Deepak Fertilizers, a private sector company, very nobly directed me to their main competitor, HOC. The private sector company is directing me to HOC, their main competitor. And told me that HOC may be able to help you with their future expansion, which was correct. Sure enough, HOC was the right choice, and during negotiations with their MD, unfortunately, their MD, Mr. Krishnamurthy, I saw that my own ISRO negotiating team, I was the chairman, was dithering, not coming to any conclusion, was actually stalling. So, once again, I stepped out for a separate confidential session with the HOC managing director. We two agreed on a price much lower than what was approved by our own member finance. My team was amazed, unable to react. I was acting against my own team. Later, the director of the propellants group sent a laudatory letter to Prof Sarabhai. This one is about how we scored over the shuttle. Shuttle boosters were using PBAN. I mentioned to you about PBAN. Polybutadiene, acrylonitrile, acrylic acid. So also SLV and ASLV. HTPB, that is hydroxy terminated polybutadiene, was a superior propellant on lab scale, etc. But it was untested in India, but chosen by PSLV. No objection to it. PSLV flew successfully before shuttle switched to HTPB. The first flight of PSLV had HTPB propellant in the booster, whereas almost equivalent size booster, shuttle boosters, still were carrying PBAN, the old propellant. I had wanted Nozzle, a Mafathalal Group company, as the most suitable producer of HTPB. Their MD laughed at me at our requirement of 30 tons per hour, 30 tons per annum, when their minimum requirement for material to be produced was 30,000 tons. I'm asking for 30 tons only. So, I was very dejected. I returned, only to get a desperate call later, a month later, that they seek our help. I was wondering what help they would require from us, since they were asked to vacate their complex on environmental grounds. This is near Vashi. They have a huge complex. They had been asked by the government to vacate the whole thing and the entire investment. So Professor Dhawan wrote to the chemical secretary, a lady called Otima Bardia, citing HTPB as strategic, which it was going to be. It was not yet strategic. Nozzle agreed to produce HTPB for us, and there are two teams, our chemical engineers and Nozzle's chemical engineers had a fantastic relationship, worked very well together to succeed in setting up the plant and even expanding it. I was simultaneously wearing 3 different hats. One was budget director, second was director for industry cooperation, and the third was coordinator for propellants, chemicals, materials and composites program, all important ones. I had to negotiate with the deputy chairman, planning commission, Manmohan Singh at that time, to approve the annual budget. His people knew that my budgets were bare bones, very carefully drawn up, and no fat in them. But when we needed much more for major projects like INSAT, IRS, PSLV, all coming in the same year, their boss flatly refused me, though he himself was a member of the Space Commission. He suggested that Sudarshan, you must have a normal 5% more than previous year. That's what your R&D basically. He had missed the whole point. When I needed 60% more that year to avoid seriously hurting the program and the schedules. At my total wit's end, also scared of what Session will say, I barged into MGK Menon's room in the Planning Commission and poured out my woes. When final meeting started next morning, Menon launched into space program priorities for 30 minutes non-stop. I never heard Menon speak so forcefully. I had known Menon from my atomic energy days. My budget was cleared without a single cut. Session didn't believe, nor did anybody. Because we are talking of going from 90 crores to 300 crores in 1 year. Facing bankruptcy, the new PM, P.V. Narasimha Rao, needed a mukhota, a mask, preferably ex-World Bank, as an FM, as a finance minister, acceptable to the World Bank. Thus, Manmohan Singh, according to me, this was the main choice of Manmohan Singh. P.V. Rao was a family friend and neighbor. Both my parents knew him well. My youngest brother and his youngest son were classmates. Both were also tutored in physics by my mother. I was in a flight from Delhi with an ISRO colleague, Mr. Jayaraman, when the PM-to-be sat in front. I joined him and bored him in Telugu about family matters. A few days later, I realized that he was in that flight with marching orders to wind up in Hyderabad and return as PM. It was just a coincidence. Now this man is called Awul Pakir Jainal Abdul Kalam. Everybody knows him. There are too many anecdotes with Abdul Kalam in ISRO. Too many. Just too many. When he became president, much later, a few of us, including ex-ISRO friends, had an informal get-together. Chandrasekhar was not there. I told them, ISRO guys may not be able to enter the White House, but can now get into Rashtrapati Bhavan anytime. Thank you.